The war in Europe had left its mark on every corner of the continent. Entire cities lay in ruins, and families were torn apart by the relentless pressure of conflict. Among the millions caught in this tide were Italian women who, by the final stages of the war, found themselves transported as prisoners under Allied control. For these women, defeat was not an abstract idea, but a lived reality carved into every face they saw and every ration they received. Yet nothing in their journey prepared them for the sight that awaited them when they came face to face with their captors. Instead of hardened commanders or seasoned generals, they encountered American officers whose youth startled them. Their first impression, formed in silence and disbelief, would become a defining moment in their captivity. Imagine the scene inside a makeshift camp on foreign soil. The air carried the heavy smell of damp clothing and earth, and the sounds of boots crunching against gravel echoed across the compound. The Italian women, many of them exhausted from long marches and crowded trains, were lined up under the watchful eyes of the guards. Their minds carried images of authority shaped by their own homeland, where leaders stood distant, severe, and weighted by age. Yet before them stood men barely older than some of the women themselves, their uniforms crisp, their movements assured, their voices steady. The shock was immediate, as though two different worlds had collided in the most unexpected way. The women's expressions betrayed a mix of emotions. There was curiosity tinged with unease as they measured the young officers who held power over them. Some felt disbelief, almost offended by the ease with which these Americans carried themselves. Others, weary from the journey, found themselves strangely reassured by the calm authority that did not rely on shouts or threats. Still, beneath all of these feelings was a deeper recognition. The war had created a space where expectations no longer matched reality. In the stillness of those first encounters, the prisoners began to sense that their captivity would not follow the patterns they had known in Italy. For the officers, the moment carried a different weight. They were tasked with the responsibility of maintaining order, of projecting confidence, even in front of strangers who represented the enemy. Yet for them, this was also a test of character. They had grown up far from the ruins of Europe, in a nation untouched by invasion, where abundance and security shaped their outlook. To stand before prisoners whose world had collapsed was to embody more than military authority. It was to reveal without words the larger divide between victory and defeat. That divide was written in posture, in tone, and in the unspoken certainty of their presence. The setting itself deepened the contrast. The camps were not grand fortresses, but functional spaces, with barbed wire fences, simple guard posts, and rows of tents or wooden barracks. Cold winds swept through the compound, rattling loose boards and carrying the faint murmur of distant conversations. In these surroundings, the difference between the guarded and the guards became even more pronounced. The Italians carried themselves with the heaviness of loss, while the Americans moved with an ease that reflected a nation yet untouched by such suffering. This visual and emotional disparity was not lost on anyone. Every gesture, every word spoken, underscored the reality that one side belonged to a world that was collapsing, while the other represented a world that was only beginning to ascend. To the women, the Americans seemed almost like figures from another era. Their youth did not suggest inexperience, but rather a kind of confidence that was difficult to grasp for those who had lived under the shadow of fascism. They were used to authority defined by rigidity and fear, not by composure and assurance. The very idea that young men could command respect without cruelty challenged what they had come to expect from military life. This challenge, quiet yet powerful, forced the prisoners to confront their own assumptions about leadership, strength, and the nature of war itself. As the days passed, the first impressions lingered in the minds of both the captors and the captives. The Italians, though weary, found themselves continually drawn back to that initial moment of shock. The Americans, too, recognized that their presence carried meaning beyond simple military duty. In the silence of the camp, in the guarded exchanges of glances, both sides understood that something larger was unfolding. This was not simply a story of prisoners and officers, but of two different worlds colliding under the weight of war. The hook of this story lies not in the clash of weapons, but in the quiet astonishment of human recognition, born in the most unlikely of places. The shock of those first encounters did not fade quickly. For the Italian women, it grew into a source of quiet conflict within themselves, a contrast that was impossible to ignore. They had been raised in a society where power was defined by distance and severity, where leaders stood apart from the people and ruled through commands that inspired fear rather than trust. Yet here, in front of them, stood young Americans whose authority seemed effortless, almost casual. They did not need to bark orders or strike fear to be obeyed. Their very presence carried weight, and their confidence was visible in every gesture. For the women, this was both unsettling and strangely fascinating. The differences became clearer with each passing day. The Italians expected punishment for mistakes, yet the Americans often relied on calm explanations and steady routines to enforce discipline. Where the prisoners braced themselves for harshness, they encountered order maintained through composure. It was not leniency, but a different kind of control, one that came from an inner assurance rather than an outward display of anger. To women accustomed to years of propaganda and a collapsing regime, this was disorienting. The war had conditioned them to believe that authority always carried cruelty, yet now they faced a version of power that felt almost alien. Imagine the scene of a daily roll call. The women, lined up with the chill morning air clinging to their clothes, waited for the inspection. They anticipated scolding or humiliation, the echoes of what they had known under fascist officers. Instead, the young Americans moved down the line with calm eyes, speaking little, their voices steady and measured. The silence was not filled with menace, but with an ease that seemed to come from confidence in their role. For the prisoners, the moment was quietly startling. It was not the power of fear that held them in place, but the realization that authority could exist without brutality. This contrast carried deeper meaning than the routines of camp life. To the Italians, it was a constant reminder of the gulf between their world and that of their captors. Their homeland had been consumed by scarcity, propaganda, and military defeats, leaving little room for such confidence. The Americans, however, moved with the assurance of a nation that had resources, stability, and victories behind it. Every interaction, no matter how small, exposed the weight of defeat on one side and the strength of resilience on the other. The women could not help but measure themselves against this divide, even as they tried to mask their thoughts in silence. The Americans themselves seemed almost unaware of the impact they made. To them, authority was a matter of training and discipline, something they carried naturally as officers. Yet the way they spoke, the way they commanded, revealed a culture that believed in confidence rather than fear. They represented a society that had not been broken by occupation or hunger. This made the difference even more striking for the prisoners, who were haunted by the memory of scarcity and failure. For the Italians, the Americans were not only captors, but symbols of another way of being, a reminder that the war had created winners and losers, not only on the battlefield, but also in spirit. The conflict was not one of open confrontation, but of perception and identity. The Italian women wrestled with the realization that their old expectations no longer applied. They had been taught to see themselves as part of a strong, disciplined society, yet their reality was one of defeat and captivity. The young Americans, by contrast, projected the very strength that fascism had promised but failed to deliver. This contradiction gnawed at the women, shaping their memories of captivity and deepening the sense of shock that had first seized them. It was not just the uniforms or the ranks that marked the difference, but the very air of confidence that surrounded these officers. Over time, this unspoken conflict became part of the fabric of camp life. The Italian women observed, compared, and reflected, while the Americans carried on with their duties, often unaware of the quiet impression they left behind. The contrast remained, vivid and unyielding, shaping every glance and every unspoken thought. In the stillness of those days, the prisoners came to understand that they were not only living through defeat, but also bearing witness to a different vision of authority and power. The war had divided nations, but here, in the daily rhythm of captivity, it revealed the deeper contrasts of spirit that would linger long after the fighting was done. To understand the depth of the shock felt by the Italian women, one must first consider the world they had come from. For more than 2 decades, fascist rule in Italy had shaped every corner of society, from the way people worked to the way they thought about authority. Propaganda filled schools and newspapers, teaching women that obedience and sacrifice were their highest duties. Leadership was portrayed as distant, severe, and absolute, a force to be feared rather than trusted. By the time the war reached its most destructive years, these women had grown used to seeing power wrapped in harshness and enforced with discipline. Authority meant survival, but it also meant submission to a state that had promised victory, yet delivered only hunger and defeat. Life under fascism had stripped people of the idea that leadership could be humane. The constant pressure of war drained resources, leaving families with little more than rationed bread, watered soup, and endless uncertainty. The women saw their brothers, fathers, and husbands conscripted into a war that dragged on with no clear end. At home, they endured shortages and the collapse of once stable routines. In this environment, authority was not questioned because questioning seemed futile. The voices of their leaders grew louder even as their power weakened, creating a cruel contradiction that shaped how these women came to view those who wore uniforms and carried rank. When captivity brought them into the hands of American officers, the contrast seemed almost unreal. These officers came from a very different background, shaped by a nation that had not endured years of invasion, occupation, and shortages. America had been far from the front lines of devastation, its cities intact, its factories productive, its people living with a level of stability unthinkable in war-torn Europe. The officers standing before the Italian women carried this stability with them. Their confidence was not an act of propaganda, but a reflection of a society still secure in its own strength. To the women, it was like meeting a living embodiment of everything they had been denied. The origins of this difference lay in the fundamental experiences of each nation during the war. Italy, exhausted by years of fighting and drained by failed campaigns, carried the scars of military collapse and political turmoil. Every defeat left its mark on the people, feeding a sense of despair that no slogan could erase. In America, however, the war was experienced from a distance. The nation's entry into the conflict had been deliberate, and its soldiers had been trained with resources that seemed endless compared to those of their European counterparts. This foundation gave American officers a natural assurance, one that could not be manufactured by ideology. To the Italian women, the difference between them was not simply one of uniform, but of history itself. Imagine the perspective of an Italian prisoner who had spent years believing the war would bring her nation honor. She had listened to speeches promising renewal and victory, only to watch her country slide into chaos and defeat. Now she stood before an American officer who spoke little, yet whose bearing suggested that his nation's promises had not been broken. The clash of expectations was profound. Authority in Italy had come to mean disappointment, but authority in America seemed to radiate success. For the prisoners, this was not only confusing, but also painful, for it revealed the hollowness of the ideals they had been made to believe. The young Americans themselves had little reason to dwell on such comparisons. For them, military service was a duty, and leadership was an extension of their training. Yet, without realizing it, they became the living proof of a broader contrast between two worlds. Their composure, their ease of command, even their youth carried meaning that went beyond the camp fences. They represented a society that had been shielded from the worst of war, one that still held on to its confidence and resources. This unspoken origin of difference was what left the Italian women in silent awe. recognizing in their captors what their own nation had promised but failed to deliver. In the end, the background of these encounters reveals why the shock was so profound. It was not only the immediate contrast of youth and authority, but the deeper clash between societies shaped by different wartime realities. The Italians carried the burden of defeat, propaganda, and scarcity. The Americans carried the strength of distance, abundance, and victory. When these two paths crossed, the moment became more than an exchange between captor and captive. It became a reflection of how war had divided not only armies, but entire ways of life. Though the encounters between Italian women prisoners and young American officers took place far from the front lines, they were deeply shaped by what had already unfolded on the battlefield. Every step the Americans took inside those camps was made possible by victories that had pushed Axis forces back and opened Europe to Allied control. For the Italian women, the war's outcome was written on the ground beneath their feet. They had lived through the collapse of their own military campaigns, the retreat of their armies, and the humiliation of surrender. To face American officers, confident and composed, was to face the human embodiment of battlefield defeat. Each salute, each command, each quiet word of authority reminded them of the losses their nation had suffered. The Americans themselves carried into those camps the spirit of men who had marched forward with momentum behind them. They came not from ruined cities or starving villages, but from a nation that had poured its industrial might into the war. Their confidence was born not only from training, but from the steady rhythm of victories that had taken them across oceans. To the Italian women, this difference was impossible to ignore. They felt the contrast in the very way the officers carried their uniforms, in their posture, in the unspoken ease of men who belonged to the winning side. Every movement echoed the battlefield, even when there were no guns or artillery in sight. Imagine the silence of a roll call at dawn. The prisoners lined up under a cold sky, their breath visible in the morning air. The Americans walked past them with steady steps, voices calm, gestures deliberate. There was no shouting, no unnecessary show of force, only the quiet authority of men who knew their position was secure. For the Italian women, the moment carried an invisible weight. Behind the calm exterior of their captors lay the power of armies that had broken through defenses, liberated territories, and crushed resistance. The battlefield was not present in the mud under their boots, but it lived in the confidence of those who commanded them. For the prisoners, this realization cut deep. They remembered their own soldiers, worn down by years of war, carrying fatigue in their eyes and hesitation in their steps. Authority in Italy had often been fragile, maintained through fear and slogans rather than victories. The Americans, by contrast, projected a strength that seemed effortless because it was built upon real momentum. The women understood that what they were witnessing was not an illusion created by propaganda, but the genuine reflection of success. It was the battlefield translated into demeanor, and it spoke louder than any weapon could. This impact was psychological as much as it was practical. The Italian women were reminded every day of the chasm between their world and that of their captors. When they saw young officers command without struggle, they were forced to recall the fragility of their own collapsing regime. When they heard calm orders delivered without threat, they compared it to the frantic tone of leaders who had once promised glory. These contrasts turned the camp into a living battlefield of memory and perception, where defeat was relived not in explosions or marches, but in the daily sight of authority carried with ease. The Americans, perhaps without realizing it, reinforced this impact with every interaction. They maintained discipline not through violence, but through composure, which only highlighted their advantage. Their presence was a reminder that victory had made them steady, that their youth was not a weakness, but a symbol of renewal. The prisoners saw in them a generation untouched by the despair that war had carved into Europe. For the Italians, this realization stung, for it revealed the cost of their nation's failures. The battlefield was behind them, but its consequences stood in front of them every day. In the quiet of captivity, the impact of the battlefield was not measured in casualties or territory, but in human encounters. The young American officers embodied the momentum of a winning army, while the Italian women bore the weight of defeat. The space between them was filled with unspoken truths, shaped by battles fought far away yet present in every glance and gesture. For the prisoners, the battlefield never disappeared. It lived in the confidence of their captors, reminding them that their own struggle had ended in surrender, while another nation's struggle had only strengthened its resolve. The contrast between Italian women prisoners and their young American officers extended far beyond the confines of the camp. What seemed at first like a personal shock soon revealed itself as part of a much larger pattern, one that mirrored the fate of nations across the war. The Italian women realized, even without words, that their experience reflected the collapse of an old order. Their lives had been molded by fascist promises of strength, only to end in captivity. By contrast, the Americans carried with them the assurance of a society ascending to global power. This difference was not simply between individuals, but between two nations standing on opposite sides of history. For the Italian prisoners, the daily presence of their captors forced them into quiet reflection. Authority had once meant obedience to speeches, parades, and the fear of punishment. Now they saw authority exercised through calm, disciplined assurance, untainted by desperation. It unsettled them, because it showed that leadership could be something other than fear. These realizations worked silently, gnawing at the certainty they had once been taught. The women began to see their captivity not only as a consequence of war, but as a lesson in how power itself could look different, depending on the nation that wielded it. The Americans, meanwhile, often remained unaware of the significance of their conduct. To them, discipline was part of training, and confidence was simply expected. They treated their role as routine, ensuring that order was maintained while the broader war continued outside the camp. Yet, in the eyes of the Italian women, every detail became symbolic. A steady voice during roll call, the respectful distance kept during inspections, the absence of cruelty in simple orders, all of it marked a new model of authority. This subtle difference carried consequences that reached beyond the barbed wire, planting seeds of awareness about the world that would follow the war. The wider consequences were felt in morale as much as in memory. For the Italians, captivity became a mirror reflecting their nation's decline. They had lived through shortages, bombings, and the slow unraveling of their country's ambitions. Now, in the presence of officers younger than many of them, they faced the proof of their defeat. The realization weighed heavily, reminding them that their nation's future would not be defined by fascist glory, but by survival in a world shaped by others. The Americans did not need to boast about victory. Their composure spoke louder than any declaration. Imagine sitting in a barrack at night, hearing the faint voices of the guards outside. The Italian women lay awake, remembering speeches that had once filled them with pride, and comparing them with the quiet reality they now lived. The steady rhythm of American patrols, the calm enforcement of rules, contrasted sharply with the chaos their homeland had endured. The silence of captivity became a space for reflection, one in which the prisoners confronted the collapse of the ideals they had once carried. The consequences of war were no longer abstract. They were present in every breath of their captors. For the Americans, the encounter had another kind of consequence. Though they rarely spoke of it, they came to see their prisoners not as faceless enemies, but as human beings caught in the ruin of a failed system. This awareness deepened the sense that the war was not only about territory or battles, but about the transformation of societies. To guard Italian women was to witness the human cost of collapse, and to recognize that victory meant inheriting responsibility as much as power. In their quiet confidence, they reflected not only their nation's strength, but also its emerging role in shaping what would come after the war. Ultimately, the wider consequences of these encounters lay in the recognition of difference. The Italian women, once loyal to a fading order, saw that power could exist without cruelty. The Americans, while holding authority, glimpsed the suffering left behind by their enemy's defeat. Between them, in the daily routines of captivity, a silent exchange unfolded. It was an exchange of lessons, of realizations, of truths that transcended the camp fences. The war had created victors and prisoners, but it had also created a stage on which two visions of authority met. The legacy of these wider consequences would endure long after the camps were empty, shaping how both sides remembered the conflict. The climax of this story unfolded not in a single dramatic confrontation, but in the slow realization of an unbridgeable gap. For the Italian women, days in captivity were marked by the constant presence of their young American officers, each encounter reinforcing the same truth. Their world had collapsed, while their captors' world stood firm. The uniforms, the crisp commands, the steady posture, all of it spoke of a nation on the rise. The women, by contrast, carried with them the exhaustion of defeat, the memory of hunger, and the silence of promises broken. This contrast reached its peak when they understood that no matter how much they adapted, they could not cross into the confidence that defined the Americans. It was the war's most personal reminder of what it meant to lose. Imagine standing in line for inspection, the gravel shifting underfoot, the cold morning air clinging to the skin. The officer passing before the prisoners is barely older than some of the women, yet he moves with the ease of someone who belongs in command. His voice does not tremble, his gaze does not falter. For the prisoners, the moment is sharper than any weapon. They see in him not just an individual, but the strength of a nation untouched by occupation, the embodiment of victory carried in youth. In that instant, the truth of their defeat becomes undeniable, not through violence, but through presence alone. The women tried to reconcile what they saw with what they had once believed. Fascist rhetoric had promised that discipline and sacrifice would lead to greatness. Yet, in their memories, that greatness had crumbled into ruins, and the men who had enforced it often carried themselves with desperation rather than composure. Now they faced captors who embodied the very qualities that fascism had claimed as its own: confidence, strength, and the authority of youth. This was the cruelest irony, for it revealed the hollow core of the ideology that had once shaped their lives. The shock was not only in the officer's age, but in the realization that true strength had come from elsewhere. For the Americans, the climax was subtler, almost invisible. They did not set out to prove a point, nor did they recognize the depth of the impression they created. Their duties were practical, their orders routine. Yet, without knowing it, they became symbols of a larger transformation. In the eyes of their prisoners, they represented the end of one world and the rise of another. The officers were simply performing their roles, but for the Italians, those roles carried the weight of history. Each calm command reinforced the fact that the war had shifted, the balance of power far beyond what speeches or propaganda had once promised. This realization, though quiet, was overwhelming. The Italian women came to see their captors as living reminders of everything they had lost and everything they could not regain. The gap between them was not just about victory or defeat, but about entire worlds of experience. On one side stood a nation that had endured collapse. On the other, a nation still brimming with strength. The women felt this gap not only in their circumstances, but in their very sense of identity. Their shock deepened into a kind of resignation, a recognition that history had chosen a path from which there was no return. The climax was not marked by shouting or violence, but by silence. It unfolded in the quiet moments, in the way the prisoners avoided the eyes of their captors, or in the way they exchanged glances among themselves when inspections ended. It was present in the heaviness of their steps as they returned to their barracks, and in the unspoken thoughts that filled the night air as they lay awake. This silence spoke louder than any words could, carrying the full weight of their realization. The climax of their story was not in action, but in awareness, the understanding that their defeat was complete, and that their captors' confidence was the clearest proof of it. In those moments, History itself seemed to narrow into a single truth. Authority, once defined by fear and propaganda, had revealed its true nature in the quiet strength of young men who carried themselves without doubt. For the Italian women, the shock of this realization would become the defining memory of their captivity. It was the point at which personal experience and global history collided, leaving them with a vision of the war that no speech or book could ever erase. The climax was human, intimate, and irreversible, a moment when the weight of the world's conflict became visible in the simple bearing of an officer's stance. As the war drew to its close and the camps began to empty, the memory of those encounters lingered. For the Italian women, the image of their youthful American officers remained vivid long after their captivity ended. It was not the barbed wire, the barracks, or even the long days of waiting that etched themselves deepest into memory, but the composure of the men who had stood before them. Their confidence had been a shock at first, a source of unease and reflection. Over time, it became a symbol of something greater, the clear difference between a nation collapsing under the weight of war and a nation ascending on the global stage. This legacy would endure, shaping how they understood not only their own defeat, but the world that followed. In the years after the conflict, many of the women returned to homes scarred by bombings, shortages, and the slow work of rebuilding. Their captivity was not often spoken of in detail, but the impressions remained. They remembered the contrast between the stern authority they had grown up with and the calm assurance of their captors. This memory became part of their private understanding of the war, a reminder that defeat was not only measured in lost battles, but in the spirit of those who emerged stronger. For the Italians, the war had been a story of promises betrayed and hopes undone. The presence of the Americans had shown them what victory looked like, not in flags or speeches, but in the quiet strength of those who carried it without effort. The Americans, too, carried their own version of this legacy. Many of the officers would return home to families, to jobs, to a nation untouched by the devastation that had scarred Europe. They likely gave little thought to the lasting impression they had left on their prisoners. For them, duty had been a matter of routine, a responsibility carried out in a chapter of a much larger war. Yet, in the way they conducted themselves, they became symbols of their nation's role in shaping the post-war world. Their composure, their youth, and their confidence were not just personal traits, but reflections of America's rising influence. Even without knowing it, they had left a mark on those who had once stood powerless before them. The legacy of these encounters cannot be measured in treaties or political speeches, but in the quiet memories carried by those who lived them. The Italian women remembered the officers as figures who embodied a new kind of authority, one that contrasted starkly with the harshness they had known. The Americans carried forward their sense of confidence into a world where their nation would take a leading role. Between them lay the silent record of what it meant to win and to lose, written not in documents, but in the human impressions left behind. This was the unspoken story of the war, a narrative that unfolded not on battlefields, but in the spaces where captors and captives faced each other. Imagine decades later, an Italian woman sitting with her family recalling fragments of her youth. She does not speak of endless speeches or parades, but of the strange shock she felt when she first saw her captors. She remembers the calm, steady eyes of a man no older than herself, and how that gaze carried the weight of a world her country could not grasp. The memory is both painful and enlightening, a reminder of the cost of defeat and the reality of another nation's strength. In her words, the war is no longer only about loss, but about the lesson that authority could take many forms. That memory becomes part of her legacy, passed down quietly, shaping how the next generation understands what came before. In the broader sweep of history, these small encounters form part of a larger narrative about power, perception, and the human cost of war. The shock of Italian women prisoners at the confidence of their young American officers was not just a fleeting impression, but a symbol of the world's transformation. It revealed the collapse of one system and the rise of another. It exposed the hollowness of fascist promises and the undeniable strength of American ascendancy. In the end, it left behind a legacy that went beyond the walls of the camp. It became part of the fabric of memory, a reminder that even in defeat, there are moments that define how history is remembered. The closing chapter of this story is not about triumph or despair, but about recognition. The Italian women came to see their captors as the embodiment of a new world, one that would shape the future they would live in. The Americans carried themselves with a quiet strength that reflected not only their role in war, but their nation's role in history. Together, in the silence of captivity, they revealed truths that still resonate. That authority can be carried without cruelty, that victory can be seen in posture as much as in battle, and that defeat is often most deeply felt not in loss of land, but in the loss of spirit. This is the legacy they left behind, a testament to how war reshapes not only nations, but the people who live through it.